Owen Hart was set to make an entrance from the ceiling, and he fell from the ceiling. And I have the unfortunate responsibility to let everyone know that Owen Hart has died.
26 years ago, Owen Hart plunged 78 feet to his death. The official report called it a tragic accident, but his brother Brett believed something far darker had happened. And now, newly surfaced evidence is changing everything we thought we knew. It looks like Brett might not have been wrong after all. Let me break it down. The night everything changed.
When Owen was falling, everybody that was there said the last thing that he yelled was, "Look out." A guy's fallen from 100 feet and he knows he's done. And the last thing he's thinking is, "Look out, I don't want to hurt you."
On the evening of May 23, 1999, over 16,000 wrestling fans packed themselves into Kemper Arena in Kansas City, Missouri, their collective anticipation creating an almost electric atmosphere that seemed to crackle through the very air itself. Millions more had shelled out their hard-earned money for the pay-per-view broadcast, settling into couches and recliners across North America, preparing themselves for what promised to be yet another absolutely electrifying night of Attitude-era professional wrestling at its most chaotic and unpredictable. Stone Cold Steve Austin, the beer-swilling, middle-finger-raising anti-hero who had come to define an entire generation of wrestling fans, was scheduled to defend his prestigious WWF Championship against The Undertaker in a brutal, no-holds-barred match that had fans salivating with anticipation. The energy coursing through that arena was absolutely palpable, the excitement so thick and suffocating in its overwhelming intensity that you could practically taste it on your tongue. But here's the thing that nobody could have possibly known at that moment. Not a single soul among the thousands of screaming fans packed into those arena seats. Not a single one of the millions upon millions of viewers watching from the comfort of their own homes across the country and around the world. None of them could have possibly imagined, not even in their darkest nightmares, what was about to unfold before their very eyes. What was supposed to be nothing more than a routine mid-card match for the Intercontinental Championship, a relatively minor bout on a stacked pay-per-view card, would instead transform into the single most horrifying, most traumatizing, most absolutely gut-wrenching moment in the entire history of professional wrestling entertainment. Owen Hart, a man who was beloved by fans and fellow wrestlers alike as the King of Hearts, was preparing himself for what should have been a memorable entrance that night. At the relatively young age of 34 years old, Owen found himself in the absolute prime of his professional wrestling career. He was a technical wizard inside those squared circle ropes, capable of performing moves that left audiences gasping in amazement. He was a natural-born comedian on the microphone, able to draw genuine laughter from crowds with his impeccable timing and delivery, and by absolutely all accounts from everyone who knew him personally, he was one of the most genuinely good-hearted, kind, and decent human beings to ever lace up a pair of professional wrestling boots and step into a ring. That particular night, he was performing under the guise of the Blue Blazer, a comedic superhero character that served as a deliberate parody of the darker, edgier programming that had come to define the Attitude Era of professional wrestling. The entrance that had been planned and choreographed for Owen was supposed to be nothing short of theatrical spectacle at its finest. Owen would descend from the arena rafters on a cable harness system, dropping from approximately 78 feet above the ring itself, and then he would comically malfunction his way down into the ring for laughs and entertainment value from the crowd. He had actually performed a similar descent before, back at Survivor Series the previous year in November of 1998, where he had used a standard full-body climbing harness equipped with a slow-release locking mechanism. That particular version of the stunt had taken what producers deemed to be far too long, approximately 10 to 15 agonizing seconds just to unclip the mechanism, and the television producers had declared it bad television, that simply would not work for their fast-paced programming. So for this particular over-the-edge event, the decision was made by those in charge to fundamentally change the entire setup of the stunt. They wanted something faster, something more surprising, something that would pop the crowd and make for better television. What they ultimately chose instead of the safer option was a Lumar nautical shackle, a quick-release clip that had been specifically designed for sailboat masts, not for suspending human beings dozens of feet in the air. This particular piece of equipment cost approximately $68 at retail price. It required only 5 to 10 pounds of pressure shoulder to completely disengage and release, and it was about to cost Owen Hart his precious life in the most tragic way imaginable. At approximately 9:35 p.m. Central Daylight Time, Owen was carefully hoisted up to the rafters high above the arena floor. He adjusted his flowing superhero cape, took a moment to chat briefly and casually with the riggers who were handling his harness, and then settled in to wait patiently for his cue to begin the descent. In his final interview before the event, footage that would eventually go viral across various social media platforms in both 2024 and 2025, spreading to millions of viewers who had never seen it before, Owen joked lightheartedly about the inherent risks of the stunt, but expressed genuine confidence that everything would go smoothly. He talked lovingly about his family, about his deep passion for doing what he loved for a living. He had absolutely no idea whatsoever that those would be among the very last recorded words he would ever speak. At precisely 9:46 p.m., as a pre-taped video package played across the enormous arena screens and on television sets across the country, something went catastrophically, horrifically, irreversibly wrong. The quick-release clip unlatched prematurely, most likely from the additional weight of Owen's flowing cape, adding unexpected tension to the mechanism, or possibly from Owen himself simply adjusting his position slightly while suspended mid-air, waiting for his cue. The mechanism, which had never been properly tested under dynamic load conditions at full height, simply gave way without warning. There was no backup system. There was no safety redundancy. There was nothing to catch him. Owen Hart fell 78 feet through the air in approximately 2 terrifying seconds. He struck the top rope of the wrestling ring chest first at an estimated speed of 50 miles per hour, his body colliding with the unforgiving steel cable covered in foam and tape with sickening force, and then he bounced violently and uncontrollably into the ring itself. The impact generated somewhere between 9,000 and 11,000 pounds of crushing force upon his body, a level of trauma that forensic experts would later compare to being involved in a serious automobile collision at highway speeds.
Boom.
Oh, no.
And Owen hits. And we're like, what happened there? And I said, well, I hate to say it, but he's gone. Brock's like, what do you mean? I'm like, I can see it. I can see the bluish tint in his lips, the paleness in his face.
Inside the ring itself, referee Jimmy Corderas heard Owen scream something on his way down through those 78 feet of empty air. Some witness accounts claim that it was simply a primal yell of absolute terror as he realized what was happening to him. Other accounts from those who were closer to the action claim that he shouted, "Look out!" at the top of his lungs, desperately trying to warn anyone who might be standing below him in the ring. Corderas, acting on pure survival instinct, dove frantically out of the way as Owen's body rebounded off the ropes with horrifying force and crumpled lifelessly to the canvas below. For a few absolutely agonizing seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity, the arena crowd packed into Kemper Arena had absolutely no idea whatsoever what they had just witnessed with their own eyes. They knew this wasn't part of the show. This wasn't scripted. This was real. EMTs who had been strategically stationed ringside per Missouri State Athletic Commission requirements rushed to Owen within mere seconds of his body hitting the canvas. Jerry, the King Lawler, Owen's broadcast colleague at the commentary table, immediately abandoned his position and sprinted desperately toward the ring to try to help, checking frantically for any signs of vital signs. Backstage in the gorilla position and throughout the locker room area, wrestlers watched the unfolding nightmare on backstage monitors in complete and utter disbelief, many of them frozen in shock at what they were witnessing. The Godfather, whose real name is Charles Wright and who was supposed to be Owen's opponent in the Intercontinental Championship match that night, was waiting nervously just behind the entrance curtain when someone rushed up and told him what had just happened. Years later, in a deeply emotional 2024 interview, The Godfather described that horrific moment in vivid detail. "I remember spending the day with Owen, talking with the girls. Then Owen was coming out. I've never seen the footage, but when that happened, I was behind the curtain. Whoever it was, maybe Bruce Pritchard, goes, 'Owen fell.' And then I'm like, what? We were looking at the monitors, and then it all went down." The pay-per-view television feed abruptly cut away to generic crowd shots, and the arena house lights were dimmed significantly in what appeared to be an attempt to obscure the horrific scene unfolding in and around the ring from the thousands of confused fans in attendance. Jim Ross, widely considered one of the greatest play-by-play commentators in the entire history of professional wrestling, was given approximately 10 seconds worth of notice before he had to somehow address millions upon millions of viewers around the world with the horrible truth of what had just occurred. His words from that moment have become permanently and indelibly seared into the memories of absolutely everyone who heard them that fateful night. Something went terribly wrong here. This is not a part of the entertainment. This is as real can be.
So my eyes are up, and he came into my peripheral vision. He came into my screen. This body, this flash.
Yeah.
Boom. And I saw his body hit the ring post or the ring, or I couldn't quite sure. And then Lawler gets up and runs over there.
Yeah.
And people come out the ring, and Jerry's there. And Jerry comes back to me, and he shakes his head like he's not going to make it.
Owen was carefully loaded onto a medical backboard and rushed out of the arena via golf cart, receiving continuous CPR and repeated defibrillation attempts along the entire harrowing journey through the arena tunnels. He was transported by ambulance to Truman Medical Center, where he was officially pronounced dead at 10:11 p.m. Central Daylight Time from massive blunt force trauma to his chest and internal organs. The subsequent autopsy would later reveal the full, devastating horror of what had happened internally to Owen's body. A complete transection of the ascending aorta, multiple rib fractures that had been driven directly into his heart and lungs by the force of impact, and absolutely massive internal bleeding that filled his chest cavity. He had lost approximately 4.2 liters of blood, roughly 80 to 85% of his entire total blood volume, within mere minutes of the initial impact. Forensic medical experts would later estimate that Owen was clinically dead within 8 to 15 seconds of his chest striking that top rope. His toxicology report came back completely clean, without any trace of foreign substances whatsoever. No drugs of any kind, no alcohol of any amount. Owen Hart died stone cold sober, completely alert and aware, and utterly betrayed by the cheap equipment that was supposed to keep him safe. And yet, in what remains to this very day one of the single most controversial decisions in the entire history of entertainment, Vince McMahon made the executive decision to order the show to continue. Popular American professional wrestling journalist and historian Dave Meltzer said,
"It was horrible. The show continuing on was a bad decision. But again, who prepares for that? I don't have I think they made a huge mistake."
After a pause of approximately 15 minutes, the over-the-edge pay-per-view broadcast resumed as if nothing had happened. 4 more professional wrestling matches were held that night on a ring mat that had just witnessed a man's violent death. The arena crowd in attendance wasn't even informed of Owen's passing until after the entire event had concluded and they were filing out of the building. Pay-per-view viewers watching at home learned the devastating news approximately 1 hour after the fall itself, when Jim Ross, his voice audibly breaking with emotion, delivered the official confirmation. Here at Kansas City, tragedy befell the World Wrestling Federation. Owen Hart has tragically died from that accident here tonight. The decision to continue the show drew immediate, intense, and lasting backlash from virtually every corner. Wrestlers throughout the company were deeply traumatized by what they had witnessed and by being forced to perform afterward. Fans were absolutely horrified by the callousness of the decision, and Owen's older brother Brett, watching helplessly from WCW, where he had defected after the infamous Montreal screwjob 2 years earlier, received what was undoubtedly the worst phone call of his entire life. His immediate gut-level reaction to the news, suspicion that Vince McMahon had somehow arranged to have his brother killed as revenge for everything that had happened between them. The investigations. In the immediate days following Owen Hart's shocking and tragic death, the Kansas City Police Department launched what would ultimately become one of the most thorough and comprehensive criminal investigations in the entire history of professional wrestling as an industry. The case was initially and officially treated as potential involuntary manslaughter under the applicable Missouri state law, an extremely serious legal designation that could have very easily resulted in criminal charges being filed against responsible parties if investigators found sufficient evidence of gross negligence or reckless disregard for human life and safety. Over the course of approximately 6 intensive weeks, dedicated homicide detectives conducted more than 50 separate interviews with individuals connected to the incident. They spoke at length with professional wrestlers who had been present that night, with the riggers who had been responsible for setting up and operating Owen's harness system, with WWF executives including Vince McMahon himself, and with medical personnel who had responded to the emergency. And what they ultimately found after all of their investigation was absolutely damning, though perhaps not in the exact way that some conspiracy theorists and internet sleuths would later choose to claim. The KCPD investigative report, which was finally released publicly in May of 2020 following a successful Freedom of Information Act request filed by wrestling journalist David Bixenspan, runs a total of 73 pages with additional detailed appendices attached. Its ultimate conclusions were completely unambiguous and left absolutely no room for alternative interpretation. There was no evidence of tampering with the equipment. There was no evidence of deliberate sabotage by any party. There was no evidence whatsoever of murder or intentional harm. The harness system had not been deliberately compromised by anyone seeking to hurt Owen. What had actually killed Owen Hart that night was something far more mundane and ordinary, yet simultaneously far more preventable. Systematic corporate cost-cutting measures and completely inexcusable negligence in safety protocols. The quick-release shackle that was at the center of the equipment failure, investigators ultimately determined, was completely and utterly inappropriate for use in human aerial stunts of any kind whatsoever. It was specifically rated for marine use only, having been designed to release under minimal pressure so that sailors could quickly free their sails during emergency weather situations at sea. Using such a piece of equipment to suspend a 229-pound professional wrestler 78 feet in the air above a wrestling ring was, in the explicit words of one expert consultant who reviewed the case, completely contrary to every single established safety standard and protocol in the entire entertainment rigging industry. The riggers who had been hired to set up and operate the stunt that night were not properly certified for aerial work involving human beings. Bobby Talbert, who served as the lead rigger on the project, had been recommended to WWF through connections in rival promotion WCW, but lacked the proper professional credentials required for high-altitude human suspension work. The entire rigging team had skipped full-height dynamic load tests, meaning they never actually tested the equipment with real weight at the actual height from which Owen would be suspended during the live show. They completely ignored industry-standard redundancies like secondary lanyards or backup safety lines that would catch a performer if the primary system failed. When an earlier, more experienced rigging expert had been consulted about the proposed stunt during the planning stages, he flatly refused to take the job because of the rushed, fundamentally unsafe design that WWF was insisting upon. WWF had been explicitly warned by professionals in the field that what they were planning was dangerous. They proceeded anyway, prioritizing cost savings and television timing over human safety. Despite all of these damning findings that pointed clearly toward corporate negligence, prosecutors in Missouri ultimately declined to file any criminal charges against WWF or any individuals involved. The legal reasoning behind this decision was complicated and multifaceted. Professional wrestlers were and still are classified as independent contractors rather than employees, which significantly limited the application of standard workplace safety regulations like those enforced by OSHA. The conduct that had led to Owen's death, while clearly and obviously reckless by any reasonable standard, was determined by prosecutors to fall short of the legal threshold of gross deviation required for involuntary manslaughter charges under Missouri state law. The case would ultimately be left to the civil court system to resolve through wrongful death litigation. Martha Hart, Owen's grieving widow, filed a comprehensive wrongful death lawsuit on June 15, 1999, naming 13 different defendants across a total of 46 separate counts of negligence and wrongful conduct. WWF responded to this lawsuit in what many observers considered to be an absolutely appalling manner. They filed a countersuit against Owen's estate, claiming that the estate actually owed WWF money in unpaid royalties from merchandise sales. This was a move that Martha would later describe in interviews as deliberately retaliatory and unnecessarily cruel toward a grieving family. The case was ultimately settled in November of 2000 for a total of $18 million, which at the time represented the largest wrongful death payout in Missouri state history for that calendar year. Martha herself received $10 million from the settlement. Their two young children, OJ and Athena, each received $3 million for their future care and education, and Owen's parents each received $1 million. Martha used the funds from her portion to establish the Owen Hart Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting children's health initiatives and educational programs. WWF, for their part, turned around after settling with Martha and sued the harness manufacturer Lumar Limited, settling that separate lawsuit for $9 million in 2003, with no admission of fault or wrongdoing from either party involved in that litigation. But while the official criminal and civil investigations had reached clear, documented conclusions based on physical evidence and expert testimony, the court of public opinion proved to be far more chaotic, unruly, and resistant to closure. In the vacuum left by professional wrestling's deliberate blurring of reality and fiction, and by WWF's selective archiving and editing of anything related to the incident, conspiracy theories began to take root in the fertile soil of grief and suspicion, and they flourished wildly over the following decades. The most persistent and most emotionally charged conspiracy theory that emerged centered on the allegation of murder, specifically the inflammatory idea that Vince McMahon had somehow deliberately orchestrated Owen's death as a form of twisted revenge against the entire Hart family for the infamous Montreal screwjob incident that had occurred less than 2 years earlier. Bret Hart himself initially harbored these dark suspicions in the immediate aftermath of his brother's death. Bret had physically punched Vince McMahon backstage after the screwjob, had publicly humiliated him on television, and in interviews, had defected dramatically to the rival WCW promotion. The animosity and bad blood between the McMahon and Hart families was absolutely real and extremely well documented by anyone who followed professional wrestling. In Bret's grief-stricken, emotionally devastated mind during those terrible first hours and days, it didn't seem entirely impossible that Vince McMahon would strike back viciously by hurting Owen as a way to wound the entire Hart family. In the 2024 Netflix documentary series Mr. McMahon, Bret Hart finally addressed these dark suspicions publicly and on camera for a massive audience. The documentary features footage of Bret candidly admitting that for a period of time after Owen's death, he genuinely wondered and worried if his brother's death had been intentional rather than accidental. But the documentary also shows Bret describing in detail how KCPD homicide detectives walked him through all of the evidence they had gathered, how they had thoroughly investigated Vince McMahon and WWF as an organization, and how they had ultimately found absolutely nothing whatsoever to support any theory of foul play or intentional harm. By the time the official investigation had concluded and the evidence had been presented to him, Bret had accepted the painful truth. His brother's death was a tragic accident caused by corporate negligence and cost-cutting, rather than by deliberate malice or murderous intent. The second major conspiracy theory that has persisted for over 2 decades involves so-called lost footage of Owen's fatal fall. Because the actual incident occurred off-camera during a pre-taped video package that was playing on the arena screens, the main pay-per-view broadcast never actually captured the fall directly on tape. This notable absence of official footage has fueled decades of intense speculation about what WWE might be deliberately hiding from the public about that night. The reality of the situation, as documented thoroughly in the Lost Media Wiki and confirmed by the KCPD investigation records, is considerably more complicated and nuanced than conspiracy theorists would prefer to believe. Fan-recorded bootleg videos shot from inside the arena do in fact exist. Grainy, low-quality camcorder footage captured by attendees sitting in the 8th row and nearby sections that shows portions of the fall. One such video recording was actually listed for sale on eBay in 1999 before being pulled down by law enforcement for use in the ongoing investigation. WWE does possess internal footage from that night that includes the medical response and internal communications audio from production, which has been archived with explicit "do not play" designations attached. The footage isn't truly lost in the sense that it no longer exists anywhere. It's deliberately suppressed, intentionally kept from public consumption and distribution out of sensitivity to the tragedy and respect for the Hart family. But that important distinction has done remarkably little to quell the rampant speculation that continues to this day. Then there remains the persistent matter of the Hall of Fame induction that has never happened. Owen Hart has never been inducted into WWE's prestigious Hall of Fame, a fact that strikes countless wrestling fans as absolutely absurd and unjust, given his undeniable, immense contributions to the professional wrestling business over his career. But here's the crucial detail that many fans don't realize. This isn't WWE's choice or decision to make. It's Martha's choice, and she has consistently and firmly refused to allow the induction to take place under any circumstances, viewing WWE's Hall of Fame not as a genuine honor to her husband's memory, but as what she has called a fake entity designed primarily to generate revenue and positive publicity for the company rather than to truly honor its inductees. Instead of partnering with WWE, she has chosen to work with All Elite Wrestling to create the annual Owen Hart Cup tournament, which honors Owen's incredible athletic legacy while simultaneously donating all proceeds to charitable causes through her foundation. It's essentially a pointed middle finger directed squarely at WWE, wrapped elegantly in genuine philanthropy, exactly the kind of clever, subversive move that Owen himself might have deeply appreciated and laughed about. What really changed everything? So here we are, more than 26 years after Owen Hart's tragic death, and people are still asking questions about new discoveries. But here's the thing that you need to understand. Something genuinely has changed in recent years, and what has changed matters far more than any hypothetical new piece of evidence or recovered footage ever could have. In September of 2024, Netflix released Mr. McMahon to their global streaming audience, a comprehensive 6-part documentary series chronicling Vince McMahon's meteoric rise to power, his numerous scandals over the decades, and his eventual dramatic fall from grace. Episode 4 of the series dedicates significant airtime to Owen's death, featuring archival footage from the era and Vince McMahon's own on-camera defense of the controversial decisions he made that night. In the documentary footage, McMahon attempts to justify his decision to continue the pay-per-view broadcast after Owen fell. Owen wouldn't want it stopped. These people came to see a show. They didn't come to see somebody die. Throughout the documentary, McMahon consistently shifts blame to the harness manufacturer rather than accepting responsibility for his company's decisions. He insists repeatedly that WWF followed all proper protocols for the stunt. He frames the entire tragedy as a freak accident that no one could have reasonably predicted or prevented. Martha Hart, who was never contacted by the documentary's producers, despite being unquestionably the most authoritative voice on her husband's legacy and the circumstances of his death, responded publicly on October 3, 2024, with an official statement that cut through McMahon's self-serving revisionism like a razor-sharp blade through tissue paper. Netflix's Mr. McMahon portrays Owen's death as a mere accident, allowing Vince McMahon to claim it wasn't our fault. Nothing could be further from the truth, she wrote in her detailed statement. She laid out in painstaking detail exactly how WWE had hired completely unqualified riggers against the explicit advice of industry experts, how they had deliberately chosen cheap equipment that was never designed or rated for human rappelling, and how they had filed retaliatory countersuits against Owen's grieving estate while simultaneously mourning his death publicly and profiting from tribute programming. I continue to hold WWE responsible for Owen Hart's death, she declared unequivocally. This is what has truly changed about Owen Hart's story. Not the underlying facts of his death, but the public's willingness and ability to finally hear and believe Martha's version of those facts, rather than WWE's carefully managed narrative. For 25 long years, WWE maintained almost complete control over the narrative surrounding Owen's death and legacy. They edited the footage to remove uncomfortable moments. They managed and restricted access to their archives. They inducted wrestlers into their Hall of Fame while Owen's conspicuous absence went largely unremarked and unquestioned by mainstream audiences. Vince McMahon remained the untouchable patriarch of an entertainment empire worth billions of dollars, and his role in Owen's death was rarely examined critically outside of niche wrestling documentaries and late-night Reddit threads frequented only by hardcore fans. But the world looks dramatically different now than it did even 5 years ago. Vince McMahon is gone from WWE entirely, forced out of the company amid the deeply disturbing Janelle Grant trafficking lawsuit that Martha herself has publicly drawn parallels to in terms of corporate culture and accountability. The documentary series that was supposedly designed to burnish and rehabilitate McMahon's legacy has instead reminded millions upon millions of Netflix viewers around the world that a beloved performer died on his watch because the company was too cheap to buy proper safety equipment, and McMahon himself was too arrogant and callous to stop the show and properly honor a fallen colleague. Social media platforms, which barely existed in any meaningful form back in 1999, now amplify Martha's voice and her foundation's message to massive audiences who might never have heard her side of the story otherwise. The Owen Hart Foundation has donated over $5 million Canadian in gifts, grants, and educational. Endowments to children's health causes, educational scholarship programs, community support initiatives, and various other charitable programs over the past 2.5 decades. The AEW Owen Hart Cup tournament has become one of the most prestigious and emotionally meaningful annual events in all of professional wrestling, with 2025's tournament winners, Hangman Adam Page and Mercedes Moné, earning world championship opportunities while simultaneously honoring Owen's incredible technical excellence and his family's enduring legacy. Bret Hart, now reconciled with his grief even if not with WWE as a company, speaks of his brother with reverence and calls Owen the best Hart. Extraordinarily high praise coming from a man who is himself widely considered one of the greatest professional wrestlers who ever lived. That's what has really, truly changed about Owen Hart's story in recent years. Not some hidden document that was finally declassified. Not some miraculously recovered footage that proves a conspiracy. But rather a fundamental cultural shift in who gets to tell Owen Hart's story and who gets to define his legacy. Owen Hart deserved so much better than a $68 sailboat clip that was never designed to hold a human being and a company that cared more about finishing a pay-per-view and protecting their revenue than honoring a man's life and comforting his grieving family. He deserved so much better than the conspiracy theories that have turned his death into macabre entertainment and the lost media hunts that treat his final moments as collectibles to be found and traded. He deserved so much better than a boss who insisted, even decades later, with the benefit of hindsight and reflection, that the show absolutely had to go on regardless of the human cost. But maybe finally, after all these years, Owen Hart is getting what he deserved all along, the truth about what happened to him, told by the people who genuinely loved him, to an audience that is finally ready and willing to listen. Owen James Hart, May 7th, 1965 to May 23rd, 1999. The King of Hearts, gone at 34 years old, but never ever forgotten. Rest in peace, Owen. Your legacy is in good hands now. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.